Today's session is algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. And I'm beyond excited to welcome our speaker for today. Florian Ayat is here to tell us everything about algorithmic regulation, algorithmic governance there is to know. Florian is a research fellow and a PhD candidate at the Weizenbaum Institute and the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. He studied social science at Humboldt University in Berlin, as well as Université Paris 8 and the New School for Social Research in New York. For his graduate thesis, he investigated the relation between computational social science and theory development by analyzing computer simulation methods. At the Weizenbaum Institute, he uses the perspective of the sociology of quantification, classification, and valuation to assess the implications of big data and AI on processes of governance and regulation. With this in mind, it makes perfect sense that his presentation is called Algorithmic Regulation and Algorithmic Governance. In the course of this presentation, Florian will give us an overview of the work done in this area in recent years. He'll provide examples to illustrate key aspects and discuss implications of these concepts for democratic practice. His presentation required all of you, or is based on the absolutely canonical text, Algorithmic Regulation, a Critical Interrogation by the wonderful Karen Young. This said, I'm beyond excited to welcome you, Florian, and I hereby hand to you. Please take it away.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to be able to speak here today. As was mentioned already, the topic is algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. And I think you also already got an impression of the structure of the lecture. So I will give a brief introduction, then I will talk about what these concepts actually mean, algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. Then I will describe two analytical frameworks for actually analyzing algorithmic regulation. I will give a case study to illustrate these frameworks. And then I will talk a little bit about what it means to have algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance in a democratic context. So which risks that might cause and what democratic responses there might be. So jumping right in, I think it's trivial today to say that algorithms play really an increasingly important role in our social life today. Yes, many scholars talk about the algorithmic society that we live in today. And what this means is that there's sort of a dual relationship between societies and algorithms. So on the one hand, we as a society shape algorithms, but then on the other hand, algorithms also shape us. And so if we think about government and the government context, this means that on the one hand, there's what we can call a governing of algorithms. So us governing algorithms, and then there's also governing by algorithms. So algorithms being used in contexts of government and governance. And it's the second one that I will talk about today. So the different ways in which we can think about governing by algorithms. And specifically, this lecture will be about algorithms that are used to intentionally shape the behavior of some group or some people according to a specific set of rules. And there are many examples that can illustrate where this might happen. So, of course, you all know that there's content moderation happening on social media platforms, where, for example, algorithms might select which contents will be amplified or which contents will not be shown on the platform at all, and so on. There are also phenomena like predictive policing, where police forces use data analytics in order, for example, to find parts of a city where the likelihood of crime might be especially high, and then send police forces to these areas. In the context of labor management, algorithms are increasingly used, and this goes sort of for all kinds of settings, from the shop floor setting and things like robotics to maybe the more micro scale of things like online gig work. Think about Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example. An infamous example by now is the Chinese social credit score, where there are multiple experiments in China on a municipal level to create sort of a social credit score based on the behavior of citizens. So things like shopping behavior, but maybe also crossing a red light on the street, and then aggregating this behavior into a quantified single score that might then be used to decide what people are allowed to do, for instance, which trains they can take, and so on. In Europe, we're experimenting with automated borders, so projects like iBorder Control that attempt to have some sort of algorithmic decision-making process, which people are allowed to cross some border or are not allowed to cross it. And of course, in Austria, there's the famous example of the AMS algorithm, where the Arbeitsmarktservice Österreich was experimenting with an algorithm that was used to predict the likelihood that some person would be reintegrated into the labor market in the future, so that they could distribute resources accordingly. And so with all of these examples, it would be nice to have concepts to be able to grasp this plethora of different phenomena and to be able to really comparatively analyze them. And so the two concepts that are used for this in the literature at the moment are these two concepts of algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. And I want to say just at the beginning that these are really emerging concepts. So there's not yet an academic consensus how they should be defined, how they should be used, and in which areas they can be applied. So we'll just really try to give an overview of the different ways in which they are being used in the literature and what we might be able to do with these concepts. And so one way I would like to approach this here is approaching these concepts through their component parts. So regulation, governance, and algorithms, and to talk a little bit about what these ideas might mean. So firstly, when we talk about regulation, we often think about sort of a very narrow understanding where it's about a singular state that attempts to somehow regulate the behavior of some economic sphere, for example, things like banking regulation. But in the context here, it's much more useful to use a broader understanding of regulation, such as the one proposed by regulation scholar Julia Black, who defines regulation as the sustained and focused attempt to alter the behavior of others according to defined standards or purposes with the intention of producing a broadly identified outcome. So a few things to note here. First of all, this really implies intentionality. So it's about a focused attempt where some actor actually consciously wants to change the behavior of some group of people. Secondly, it doesn't say anything about how this behavior change is achieved. So it can be really direct, targeting specific individuals, but it can also be more indirect, targeting, for example, the environment of some group of individuals. Then it's also not restricted to states. So the regulator can be all kinds of entities like private companies and so on. And it's also not restricted to the economic sphere. So all kinds of spheres, all domains of social life can be subject to regulation in this concept. And then finally, the regulatee, so the instance that is being regulated, can be any kind of group, and it can also be the regulator itself, as we have it, for example, in the concept of self-regulation. And so this includes, of course, the canonical example of banking regulation, but it also includes things like, for example, traffic lights that are used to regulate the behavior of drivers on the street. It includes phenomena like cookie buttons, where, for example, maybe the accept cookies button is larger and very green, very visible, so that the behavior of people is changed in a way that they might accept the cookies, and also things like quantified self. So people using gadgets to track their behavior and to regulate themselves would be part of this broad concept. And an advantage of this concept is really that it makes it possible to talk about things like regulation by design. So regulation through some changes in the built environment around us. And a good example of this are these speed bumps that you all know that are used in streets in order to regulate the speed of cars on the street, that make it possible to not directly target the drivers themselves in some way, but just change something in the environment and then affect some behavior change in this way. And if we go to the digital world, this idea is very well expressed in this notion of code is law, developed by the legal scholar Lawrence Lessig, who really wanted to point out that individuals can not only be regulated by sort of market forces or laws or social norms, but also by the architecture around them. And so in the digital world, of course, architecture includes things like computer code. And a good example here in this digital world would, for example, be a password protection on a website, where if you're not entering the correct password, you're simply not able to access some content on this website. So this really shows that software code can really be in a very powerful means to regulate the behavior of people. So jumping to the next concept, to this governance concept, which is kind of a little bit tricky in the literature because there's not really a consistent way of defining it. But overall, this notion tries to express this sort of movement from this restrictive view of government to a broader understanding that is not limited to this sort of command and control understanding where one singular state is able to directly steer society, but it's more about a broader process of negotiation and coordination that involves a large number of actors, which can be sort of different actors within the state, but also actors from civil society, from the private sector, and so on. So it really stresses this kind of decentralized aspect of government, but also this procedural aspect of government that is about this process of continually finding and redefining rules that are given for some context. And so for this reason, the scholar Holger Strassheim has defined governance as reflexive coordination. So all of these situations where some actors are trying to coordinate their behavior and to find some rules, but then also find rules for the coordination of this coordination process. So this reflexive dimension of social coordination. And now one might ask, what is the relation between regulation and governance? And again, unfortunately, there are many different understandings and it's not quite clear and consistent in the literature. So they might be sort of thought of as overlapping. One could also think that maybe regulation is a specific form of governance. This is expressed in this notion of regulatory governance in the sense of governance through regulation. But for the context here, it's not really that important to go that much into the details, but it's just important that both of these concepts, regulation and governance, describe some sort of process of social ordering. So a process in which social order is produced and maybe also reproduced. And they kind of have different emphases. So the regulation concept stresses more this aspect of the enforcement of rules and how behaviors are changed according to some rules, whereas governance focuses more on the sort of process of finding and negotiating these rules. So going to the next concept, which is algorithms, and which is kind of sort of has become kind of a mythical concept nowadays. Everybody's using it, but it's often not quite clear what exactly it means. And here in this image that I showed you earlier already, I asked an image generating AI to give me an image of an algorithm. And that's what I came up with. So maybe that indicates that even sort of AIs don't exactly know what an algorithm might be. And so for this reason, I think it's useful to go back to this really technical definition of algorithms used in computer science, where there's a field called computability theory that really mathematically defines what computers can do, and sort of computers in a very abstract sense, which are called Turing machines. And in this perspective, everything that a computer can do in this sense is an algorithm. And so more specifically, an algorithm is a precise, which means computer readable and finite step-by-step procedure for solving some kind of problem. To make this a little bit more concrete, we could think what would be a problem that we could want to solve. For example, we could want to sort a set of numbers, like the sequence here, 5, 3, 1, 4, 2, and we want to sort this. And actually, there's an algorithm for this. There are many algorithms, but one of them is insertion sort. You can see here sort of a pseudocode representation of this algorithm that might be kind of complex if you haven't seen this kind of thing before, but we can translate this into a more human language in which it just says, go through all the numbers from left to right, except for the first one, and then move the current number left until the number left of it is smaller. So just we can do this with these numbers. We would start with the 3. We would move it left once because 5 is bigger. Then we would go to the 1, move it left once because 5 is bigger, move it left once because 3 is bigger. We would go to the 4, move it left once, move it left once, and then stop because 3 is smaller. Then go to the 2, move it left once, move it left, and then stop because 1 is smaller. And so we have sorted these numbers. And this, of course, kind of silly example is just to show that this is exactly what algorithms are. They're very precise, step-by-step instructions for solving some sort of problem. And I think really showing these kinds of examples can help us to not think about algorithms as these very magical things that can do everything, but just very precise and simple instructions for how to solve some mathematical problems that also has, of course, its limitations. Now, a quote by Karen Young, social scientists typically use the term as an adjective to describe the socio-technical assemblage that includes not just algorithms, but also the computational networks in which they function, the people who design and operate them, the data and users on which they act, and the institutions that provide these services, all connected to a broader social endeavor and constituting part of a family of authoritative systems for knowledge production. So this shows that actually in the social sciences and maybe also in everyday life, we have this much broader understanding of algorithms, where they are kind of a symbol or a metaphor for some process involving software. And it might also be a metaphor for whole societies. So whereas we talked about, for example, the information society maybe 20 years ago, now we talk about the digital society or the algorithmic society. But I think it's really still useful to keep this technical notion that we just discussed in mind, to not fall into this fallacy that algorithms are these kind of magical things that we cannot really talk about. And there's a great paper by Paul Durish that really shows these differences and tries to set apart algorithms from things like automation, code, architecture, materialization, which we might usually conflate with algorithms. Now, another quote by Karen Young, although computational algorithms include those that encode simple mathematical functions, so like the one that we just saw with the sorting, the excitement surrounding big data is largely attributable to sophisticated machine learning algorithms. So algorithms that learn the structure from some sort of training data. For example, given a large amount of images of cats, this algorithm might learn to recognize cats in new images. And these are often these kind of interesting algorithms that we actually mean when we talk about algorithms in the social sciences or in everyday life. We often refer to machine learning algorithms. But again, I think it's really important to keep this technical definition in mind, because very often it turns out that the algorithms that are used are actually much more simple. And there's a great paper by Anthony Amichele, who shows that, for example, banks that use algorithms to ensure compliance actually turn out to use quite simple algorithms rather than some fancy machine learning program. And of course, for example, the AMS algorithm also turned out to use quite a simple regression model. So now I think we're equipped to tackle these concepts of algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. And a definition for algorithmic regulation that Karen Young gives is that they are decision-making systems that regulate a domain of activity in order to manage risk or alter behavior through continual computational generation of knowledge from data emitted and directly collected in real time on a continuous basis from numerous dynamic components pertaining to the regulated environment in order to identify and, if necessary, automatically refine or prompt refinement of the system's operations to attain a pre-specified goal. So obviously a very large definition, but I think we can highlight the most important aspects here. So it's about decision-making systems that somehow regulate a domain of activity using knowledge generated by computers in some sense. And luckily, she also gives a more concise definition, saying that algorithmic regulation refers to regulatory governance systems that utilize algorithmic decision-making. Similarly, for algorithmic governance, we can use the definition by Katzenbach and Ulbricht, who say that algorithmic governance is a form of social ordering that relies on coordination between actors, is based on rules, and incorporates particularly complex computer-based epistemic procedures. So here again, there's a focus on this process of social ordering that somehow uses computer-based epistemic procedures, where epistemic just means knowledge related, so knowledge generated by computers. And quite fittingly, Ulbricht and Young point out that there's no clear-cut difference between these two terms, so algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance, and that the definitions adopted by the authors that use them reveals substantial overlap. And so, in fact, these concepts are often used quite interchangeably in the literature, where both sort of very generally refer to a directed process of social ordering that uses knowledge generated by computers in some sense. And I think this is also how we can use them going forward in this lecture, just keeping in mind that there's this sort of different emphasis of regulation focusing more on the behavior change and governance focusing more on the rule-finding dimension. Just a quick word about the general relation between technology and society in these concepts, because I think it's important to clarify that there's no determinism in either direction implied by these concepts. So, for example, we could think that algorithms totally determine how the regulation or governance process works, which would be sort of this techno-determinist position. Or we could think that algorithms are just used by regulation and governance in a way that completely adjusts to how the regulation and governance is supposed to work, which would be more this social determinism perspective. And instead, I think it's important to keep in mind that there's always a kind of mutual influence between the technology involved and the social processes in which they are embedded. And similarly, and this is also a point that Karen Young makes in her paper that you have read, is the fact that these algorithmic regulation and governance systems are always embedded in larger socio-technical paradigms, like dataism, so the belief in the superiority of data, or solutionism, this tendency to use technological fixes for social problems, or surveillance capitalism, so this particular form of economic organization that relies on the surveillance of populations. So after we have kind of clarified these concepts, I will now jump into more fine-grained conceptual frameworks for how we can actually work with them and how we can use them to analyze empirical phenomena. And the best starting point for this, of course, is the paper by Karen Young from 2018, in which she really put this concept of algorithmic regulation in the center of academic attention. And what she did in this paper was that she adopted a cybernetic perspective on algorithmic regulation, where cybernetics is sort of this research field from the 40s and 50s onwards, which tried to find the patterns in information and control context, both in sort of machines and organic systems. And this cybernetic perspective would suggest that every control system, so systems like algorithmic regulation systems, that every control system consists of these three dimensions. So information gathering and monitoring, standard setting, and enforcement and behavior modification. And just to give an example, for example, you can think about the thermostat that you might have at your home to regulate your room temperature. And this thermostat would, for example, continually measure the current room temperature in your room, which is the information gathering. It would also have a standard setting component where you, as a user, would indicate your desired room temperature, so like 20 degrees Celsius. And then there would be an enforcement and behavior modification component where the thermostat continually checks if the current room temperature is below the desired temperature, and if it is, it would start heating to adjust the temperature. And this is sort of the way one can think about all kinds of control systems in this perspective, that they have an epistemic component, a normative component, and this effective component. And so what Karen Young does in this paper is that she takes these three dimensions and she introduces further distinctions in order to describe algorithmic regulation systems. So in the dimension of information gathering, she distinguishes between reactive and preemptive systems, where reactive systems only administer some sort of behavior change after a particular piece of data is recorded, and preemptive systems try to make some sort of prediction about what might happen in the future. So for reactive systems, you could think about, for example, a speed control machine on a highway that measures the speed of a car on the highway, and only if it has driven too fast, it will administer some sanction. Whereas a preemptive system tries to make some sort of prediction about what might happen in the future. And an example here might be a system that scans passenger data and flags people that could be potential terrorists at an airport, and that will then be maybe not allowed to board the plane, or will at least have some further investigation based on something they might do in the future. In standard setting, she distinguishes between fixed and adaptive standards, so standards that are fixed once and for all, and standards that can be changed dynamically in the process of the regulation. And finally, in the behavior modification dimension, she distinguishes between automated system and recommender systems. So systems that really in an automated and fully automated way administer some sort of sanction, and systems where there's a human in the loop. So where there's a human being that would maybe get a recommendation, get a suggestion from the algorithmic system, and then react further. So in this terrorism example, there might be a flag indicated by the system, but then a human operator would continue to do some further investigation or check the case further. And so using these distinctions, we arrive sort of at 8 different types of algorithmic regulation that already really helps us to analyze concrete empirical cases we might encounter in the real world. So building on this framework by Karen Young, I will now present another framework that is an extension of it, and that I developed together with my colleagues Florian Irkmeier and Lena Ulbricht. And here we make some propositions for a different vocabulary, and also include some other sub-dimensions to make it more fine-grained and better suited for empirical analysis. So the first dimension, which used to be called information gathering, we now call representation, in order to indicate that it's not only about this very objective and neutral process of simply gathering data that are somehow out there, but that is always a process of epistemic construction, always a process of looking at the world in some way or another, deciding which aspects are relevant and which are not, and sort of making some sort of simplification of the world in order to represent it in digital tools. And so the first step that would happen here is the feature selection. So the selection of which variables are actually relevant for the regulation system and which are not, which aspects are relevant. So in the example of the highway speed system, this might be simply the speed of a car. In other systems, it might be things like the age or gender of a person. And yet other systems, it might be something like the input of a video camera. Then after these variables are selected, of course, there needs to be a production of data points, so that these variables need to be actually filled with some sort of data. And we really stress that this is this might be a very complex process that involves many socio-technical elements. And it might be something like a human being walking around doing a survey. It might be someone sort of entering data manually into a database. But it might also be a process where some computer sensors automatically detect some data, or it might be things like web crawling and so on. Then there needs to be some kind of interpretation of data. So in order to make it kind of usable, actionable, and to turn it into knowledge, there needs to be some interpretation of this data. And this can be done with what we call epistemic tools. So things like simple if-then rules, like if A is true, then B is also true. Or things like statistical analysis, like if A is true, then B is likely going to be true. But it can also be things like optimization algorithms matching, for example, workers to some tasks. And what we really stress here is that one can distinguish between descriptive and inferential tools. So on the one hand, tools that really just take the gathered data as it is, and then tools that make some additional inference on top of it. For example, saying that if a person has female gender, then she's likely going to have these other characteristics as well. Or for example, if a person did something in the past, it's likely that the person will also do something else in the future. And this is exactly what Karen Young means with this distinction between reactive and preemptive systems. And then finally, we can say that this process of representation can be more or less adaptive. So it might be able to change the selected features of the data production over time, and it might also be more or less opaque, so more or less transparent to someone observing it from the outside. And I think I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Now, just going to the next dimension of standard setting, which we call direction. And here we distinguish sort of a number of different layers in which standard setting can happen, where first of all, of course, there needs to be some sort of general goal of the regulation system. In the case of the highway speed control, this would, for example, be making the road traffic safer in a very general way. But this then needs to be broken down into different standards. In this case, for example, just keeping the average speed on the highway below some threshold. And this can be distinguished again into internal or external standards, but I will talk about this more in the case study. And then finally, these standards need to really be implemented into concrete indicators that can actually be measured in a very concrete way. So here it would be, for example, the speed measuring system that is really installed at some particular place in some specific time on the highway to measure the speed. And again, here we can have varying degrees of adaptivity and opacity. And yes, exactly. Here, the adaptivity is precisely what Karen Young has in her framework, the distinction between fixed and adaptive standards. So now going to the third and final dimension of intervention. Here we use this concept of intervention instead of behavior modification to really point out that it's not a given that behavior modification attempts will actually be successful. So often nothing will happen or something unexpected will happen. So it's really more about doing some sort of intervention into the system rather than actually necessarily changing behavior in the way that was intended. Here again, we can have varying degrees of automation, as we talked about in Young's distinction between automated system and recommender systems. But then we can also have a closer look at how behavior is actually changed. So what are the strategies of influence that these systems make use of? Here we draw on an interesting idea by science and technology studies scholar Bruno Latour, who just recently died, and in a very famous paper made some thoughts about an imaginary hotel that would like their customers to leave the hotel key at the reception when they go out for a walk, so that they don't lose the key when they walk around. And he was thinking about how they might be able to achieve this, and came up with these two basic modes of doing this, which are incorporation and excorporation, where incorporation really focuses on sort of the subjectivity of the individuals and their morality and so on. And here, for example, the hotel people might say things like, if you leave, please give the key to us at the reception before you take a walk, so that you don't lose it. Or they might put up a sign saying the same thing. So really addressing the subjective morality of the person. Whereas in excorporation, it's more about changing the built environment around them. So in this case of Latour, it would be, for example, putting a heavy weight, attaching a heavy weight to the key, so that it just becomes uncomfortable for the person to carry around the key, so that it becomes more likely that they will give the key to the reception when they leave. And then having a closer look at excorporation, a group of authors called the Berlin Script Collective finds three different types in which this can happen. So there's coercion, so threatening something bad. There's inducement, so promising something good. And then there's initiation of reinterpretation, so offering some additional information that might then change the behavior of the person. Building on top of this, we suggest two further modes. So one of them is influence through non-rational properties. And this goes back to this whole discussion from behavioral economics and psychology, where there's been a lot of research that we as human beings don't often have very rational decision-making procedures, but use kind of these mental shortcuts. And this is also discussed under the rubric of nudging in some fields. And here, a very typical example from this nudging discourse would, for example, be a cafeteria that puts the healthy snacks, so things like fruits, in the front of the cafeteria, and the unhealthy snacks, so things like chocolate or chips, in the back of the cafeteria, so that it just becomes more likely that people will simply grab whatever is right in front of them. And lastly, there's a mode that we call architectural constraint, in which it's about simply making things impossible. So in the analog world, this would be something like building a wall on a street so that people can't walk there. But in the digital world, of course, there are many more options, like the one we discussed earlier, about the password protection, where you simply cannot enter a website if you don't have the correct password. And again, here we can have varying degrees of adaptivity and opacity of this intervention mode. So this was just a brief run through this kind of framework. And now I will go a little bit into a case study to explain this further, how it can be used. But before this, I just want to make some remarks about the limitations of this framework. It represents something that we would call the designer's perspective. So it kind of tries to reverse engineer what someone would think about when they were designing an algorithmic regulation system. And it's not really about the actual embeddedness in the social world when it is then put to use. So of course, there are a large number of different social practices that will happen when an algorithmic regulation system is actually used in the wild, including things like subversive practices, so people trying kind of circumvent the system, to game the system, and so on. So in reality, of course, algorithmic regulation always needs to be studied, embedded into these social practices. So yeah, after this disclaimer, I would like to present a brief case study of the case of Uber, which you probably know already. It's a ride-hailing platform that provides an app for drivers and an app for passengers. And they have the functionality to sort of match drivers and passengers so that the drivers can give taxi services to the passengers. It's important to note here that Uber generally does not consider their drivers their employees. So they say that they're merely a platform, merely a neutral intermediary that is not an employer of these drivers. So now we can go through this sort of framework to have a closer look at how algorithmic regulation happens at Uber. Firstly, we would ask, what are the representation modes that Uber uses to represent the regulation system to themselves? And here, the most central resource, of course, are the Uber apps. They provide things like the location of the drivers and the customers, a description of the drivers. They also have, through the smartphones, data of accelerometer, so giving things like driving behavior, acceleration behavior, braking behavior of the drivers. Then, of course, Uber has things like geographic maps and traffic data that they use to represent the regulation system. But they also have custom hardware, so things like the Uber beacon that gives them additional data streams like barometer data and so on. Uber then uses a number of epistemic tools to make use of this kind of data that they have. For example, algorithms for matching drivers and passengers, algorithms for route optimization to get people from A to B. And they also use machine learning at various points of the process, for example, in allocating pickup spots in their Uber Eats service. But of course, it's important to mention here that being a private company, not all of their digital systems are sort of open source or transparent. So there are, of course, limits to investigating how exactly they are doing this representation step. And then finally, one could ask oneself, what about this adaptivity and opacity of this representation step? And here, a really good example is what Uber calls surge pricing. So whenever there's a shortage of drivers in a particular area of a city, so if there's too much demand, then they will automatically designate this area as a surge pricing area. And that means that in this area, the prices that can be earned when the drivers go there will be elevated. So there will be a higher price paid to the drivers in order to incentivize them to actually go to these areas where more drivers are needed. And one can easily see that this, on the one hand, gives really increased adaptivity of this representation system, because they can, of course, dynamically adjust the way they represent this map according to the supply and demand that is there in this area. But then on the other hand, it also increases opacity because the algorithm that they use to determine these search zones is not really openly available. So, for example, the drivers are not perfectly aware how these search zones are calculated. Now, going to the next dimension, this direction step. Here, of course, being a private company, Uber's general goal is the maximization of profit. I think that's safe to assume. But then they have to break this down into different standards, how they can achieve this goal. And this might include things like good driver-passenger matches or achieving high prices and so on. And these are all things they can measure internally. So they can measure these standards using data that they have internally. They know how the driver-passenger matches work, which prices have been achieved, and so on. But then they might also be interested in high customer satisfaction. And here they use a rating system. So whenever a customer is done with the ride, they are asked by the app to give a 1 to 5 star rating, evaluating the performance of the driver. And this evaluation will then be aggregated on the profile of the driver and will then be used in the evaluation by Uber itself. And this is what we call external standard cascade. So where these algorithmic systems are used to systematically incorporate the evaluations of external actors, so here the customers, into the standard setting procedure that Uber uses to regulate the behavior of drivers. And so finally, the last step of the algorithmic regulation process would be intervention. Here we had this distinction between incorporation and excorporation. And on the incorporation side, it's kind of hard to make really good assessments because, of course, it's hard to look inside these Uber drivers. But there is a great paper by Rosenblatt and Stark who did interviews with Uber drivers, and where one Uber driver said that he was waking up dreaming of surge pricing. So this might indicate that there's actually really some psychological incorporation going on between the drivers and the algorithmic platform. But it's much easier to say things about this excorporation dimension. And here, of course, there's fear of coercion, so this first element, because actually the drivers are constantly confronted with this threat of being excluded from the platform. If their evaluation metrics, or this average rating, drops below some defined threshold, they will be threatened to be excluded from the platform and not be able to be Uber drivers anymore. There's also monetary inducement, as we've seen with this surge pricing, where higher prices are offered to go to particular areas. There's initiation of reinterpretation, for example, through the navigation function of the app, that just makes it more likely that the drivers will go in a certain way that Uber has determined. There's also use of non-rational characteristics. And a good example here is what's known in psychology as loss aversion. So the fact that human beings often tend to prefer avoiding some sort of loss over gaining the same amount. And here, one example is that when Uber drivers are logging off, they might get this notification: are you sure you want to go offline? Demand is very high in your area. Make more money, don't stop now. So it's systematically sort of using this psychological loss aversion of drivers to present some potential future loss to change their behavior to maybe keep driving. And finally, there's architectural constraint through all these options and things that cannot be done in the app, as I've already described. So for example, it's not possible to cancel a ride after it has been accepted without negative consequences. So some lessons that can be drawn from this brief case study of the algorithmic regulation at Uber. Firstly, regulation can sort of be hard to find. So whereas Uber claims that they're merely a neutral intermediary, looking at this whole process through this perspective of algorithmic regulation, we can see that there's actually a lot of behavior change, intentional behavior change happening from the side of Uber, which would suggest that actually they kind of do operate more as an employer than just a neutral intermediary. We can also identify trends that might be typical for algorithmic regulation. So, for example, representation might become more adaptive or more opaque. Direction might become more decentral and reputation-based. And intervention might become more targeted through things like notifications. And there might also be new options for architectural constraints in these digital environments. And also, one can say that if we analyze this this regulation by algorithms in more detail, we might have a starting point for really doing a better regulation of algorithms, just by understanding better how algorithmic regulation works. And this might also, of course, point to future avenues for critique and ways to criticize algorithmic regulation. Of course, this was an example from the private sector, and just to give sort of a little bit of balance to show that there's also a lot of algorithmic regulation happening in the public sector, I'm just going to give some examples from the public sector very briefly. So, of course, we already talked about predictive policing. Then there are examples, for example, in Sweden, where the public employment service uses a predictive algorithm to determine the eligibility of individuals for unemployment services. In the Netherlands, there was a system in use that automatically predicted the likelihood that a child would suffer abuse, so that so there could be some intervention into this. In Australia, there was the famous Centrelink system that automatically calculated whether a person was owing tax debt to the state, and that actually made a lot of errors, causing a lot of false demands for repayments to the government. In India, there has been the introduction of this Aadhaar system, so a huge biometric system that covers basically the whole population of India and is a basis for the rendering of public services in the country. Of course, also in Austria, there's the famous AMS algorithm that I already talked about briefly. Then there are things like passenger name record agreements between the EU and the US that might be used to automatically flag terrorist activity, as we also already discussed briefly. And then also in areas like environmental governance, there's increasing use of algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance. So as a last step, I would just like to say a little bit about what happens if these algorithmic regulation and governance systems are deployed within a democratic context. So I think, as has become, as I've tried to indicate, systems of algorithmic regulation and governance are increasingly becoming really a central part of our societal infrastructure. But at the same time, they might in different ways conflict with the democratic values that we have. Because, of course, they're not necessarily built into these systems. And this is true, of course, with respect to the public sector, where we might have very strong democratic expectations about how the public sector and the state operate, but it's also true with respect to the private sector. As we've just seen in the example of Uber, where, for example, these techniques of algorithmic regulation might allow Uber sort of hide or to sort of downplay the way in which it's actually regulating the drivers, and thereby avoiding things like labor regulation and so on. So being aware that this is just a very general overview, I would like to talk about some of the most important risks to democracy that these algorithmic regulation and governance systems might pose. And the first one here that's very prominently discussed in the past years is this issue of fairness. So the concern that algorithmic regulation might really treat particular groups very unfairly. And the most famous, most well-known example here is this COMPASS algorithm that's being used in the United States to give judges predictions about the likelihood that some defendant will recommit a crime in the future. And research has shown here that this algorithmic system is actually strongly biased against people of color in the sense that they have a much higher likelihood of getting a false positive prediction, so a prediction that they will recommit a crime, even if they statistically will not. And so this has caused a large debate about potential biases and discrimination and really embedded into these algorithmic systems, and also concerns about feedback loops. So the fact that existing social inequalities might be reinforced, might be reproduced, but also even strengthened. Secondly, there are concerns about the transparency of these systems. So we might have this expectation in a democratic setting that we're able to somehow have some transparent view into what is going on in these regulation and governance settings, especially in the public sector. But algorithmic regulation systems pose threats to this transparency expectation, or pose possibilities of opacity in three ways that Jenna Burrell has described in a very famous paper. And here, the first one are sort of intentional secrets, where an organization consciously decides to hide some aspects of the algorithms to make them intransparent, for example, because of trade secrets or similar reasons. Then secondly, there's the issue of technical illiteracy. So the fact that some of these systems might be so complex that people without large technical expertise might not be able to understand them. And this, of course, might be a problem in the larger context of democratic publics, where not everybody is an expert on algorithmic systems. And finally, there's this concern with inherent opacity, which is sometimes also called epistemic opacity. So really an opacity that is ingrained into the systems that are so complex that even with technical expertise, it's not possible to understand them. And this is often discussed with this machine learning method, artificial neural networks that tend to have really a large number, millions or even billions of coefficients attached to them, so that even if you have technical expertise about neural networks, you might not be able to really understand what they're doing. Thirdly, there are concerns with privacy and surveillance connected to algorithmic regulation, which of course is understandable if these systems rely on huge amounts of data about populations in order to make automated decisions. And here the concern is really with the power imbalances that might arise or might be strengthened when there are these data and surveillance imbalances, and the regulators have increasing amounts of data about the behavior of individuals. And this is true on the one hand, of course, in terms of the public sector, so fears of a surveillance state, but then also there are concerns about this model of surveillance capitalism, so a form of capitalism that really relies on the monetization of behavior data about large populations. Then there are concerns about depoliticization, and this is connected to the fear that if there's an increasing belief in the sort of objectivity and neutrality and efficiency of algorithmic systems, that this might decrease the participation and democratic deliberation of these algorithmic systems that is possible. So this might be the case if one simply thinks that algorithmic systems are the objectively better solution that doesn't have to be discussed in any way, or it might be that people are not really able to understand the systems and therefore not be able to democratically deliberate about them. This, of course, reflects all the discussions that we've had for a long time about technocracy, so the fear that technical expertise really plays a central role in the way that democratic governance works. And then lastly, there are concerns, not that much discussed, but I think also important, about organizational formalization. And this goes back to this idea that organizations always sort of have this formal component about formal rules and hierarchies and so on, but then also an informal component, which is about the actual human beings, the everyday interactions that actually make the organization work in real life. And here the concern is that if the formal organization is increasingly expressed in these algorithmic terms that really require strong formalization, it might not allow intervention by human beings, then the formal organization might become dominant with respect to the informal one, which might cause a lot of problems. So, of course, there are many other risks that I cannot discuss here. And it's, I think, also important to keep in mind that these risks are sort of intertwined in some way. For example, the issue of fairness might become even worse if it's not possible to investigate the system, if the system is not transparent, so that discrimination, unequal treatment, and bias cannot even be pointed out by observers. I'm going to skip this for reasons of time and just say a little bit about some possible democratic responses to these risks that I just discussed. So, of course, there are different approaches to regulating algorithmic regulation itself. A very popular approach today is the so-called risk-based approach. Here I have this image by Kraftzweig and König, who propose a way to regulate algorithmic systems according to this risk matrix, where on the one hand we have the amount of agency loss or loss of autonomy, and on the other hand we have the potential harm that the system can cause. And they suggest that if both of them are high, it would be reasonable to outright ban algorithmic decision systems, whereas if both of them are low, it's sufficient to have sort of some kind of market accountability. And then in between there are varying shades of gray, varying strengths with which one could apply regulation to these systems. There are a number of legal responses, which I cannot even start to discuss in their entirety here, but of course there's existing data protection and anti-discrimination law, where there's currently a large debate about the extent to which it can be applied to these more advanced algorithmic systems and what maybe has to be changed. There are things like the right to contest in the general data protection regulation on the EU level. So things like Article 22 that sort of prohibit fully automated decisions about data subjects in many cases. There are also proposals about new rights to be conceived, so things like a right to reasonable inferences. But just to point out that sometimes these legal responses can also be tricky. For example, if we think about the GDPR Article 22, which prohibits fully automated decisions, there has been a lot of research that showed that actually in practice, even if we have a recommender system that simply gives a recommendation to a human user, often in many cases, the human operator will simply follow the suggestion of the algorithmic systems. This can be because they actually think their decision is superior, or it could be simply because of time reasons. And so this is called the automation bias. And then the question arises, well, how effective is this Article 22 if even recommender systems are in practice sort of de facto fully automated systems? There are a number of other approaches that can be that are possible with respect to algorithmic regulation. For example, things like setting explicit standards for the public sector. In the United Kingdom, for example, there's this Aqua book that really defines quite precisely how computational knowledge, computational modeling can be used in a government context, and what the standards are for these systems to actually be used. There are approaches like AI ethics that are very popular at the moment, and that really target more the professional ethics of the people involved in designing and shaping these systems and trying to improve the democratic compatibility of the systems in this way. There are also ideas discussed about certification systems. So things that we know, for example, from the sustainability space, where we have things like organic labels that are put on certain products. So the idea here is that this kind of certification system could also be applied to algorithmic decision-making systems, and to have this sort of more market-based solution. Then, apart from all these kind of regulatory and more legal responses, I think there's a huge role for politicization, resistance, and protest from all parts of society to play here. Just to mention a few, one thing that is going on at the moment is what I would call politicization through research. So there's a field called fairness, accountability, and transparency that is actually an academic field that researches issues like fairness and transparency in machine learning system, but then is really also heavily involved in politicizing these systems through their research. Of course, there's also a role to play for a large number of civil society actors like NGOs and so on. But apart from that, I think there also needs to be a resistance and mobilization by people like tech workers and social movements and so on, that kind of protest against existing and unjust forms of algorithmic governance, which, for example, Hannah Bloch-Weber has recently written about. And a really good example of this has taken place in 2020 in the United Kingdom, when, due to the COVID pandemic, high school students were not able to participate in the final high school exams. And then the agency that was responsible for these high school exams actually decided to deploy sort of an algorithmic formula to predict the grades of the students based on past performance of students in similar areas. And as you might imagine, there was a huge protest against this sort of approach, which actually ended up being able to revert the use of this algorithmic system. And as this tweet here suggests, the main slogan of this protest was "F the algorithm," and the tweet then writes, "Weird, they're not chanting fairness, accountability, and transparency." So this might suggest that there are really multiple ways, multiple levels in which protest and resistance against algorithmic governance can be enacted throughout society. So on this more protest-based level on the streets to this more academic level of fairness, accountability, and transparency, which of course can have multiple interactions as well. Finally, I would like to point to strategies for democratizing the actual design of these algorithmic governance systems. So ways to find new forms of inclusion of stakeholders and people that are affected into shaping these algorithmic governance systems, where one approach is something like participatory modeling, where the idea is to bring people that are affected by computational models, computational forms of knowledge representation into the process of building these models themselves, and to have this kind of inclusion of those who will actually be affected by the system. Beyond this, I think it's really important to have things like science communication understood really broadly as a societal conversation about all the assumptions that go into algorithmic governance, and that might really help to have a broader societal deliberation and negotiation of the political role that algorithmic governance and regulation will play in the future. So just to wrap up, I think I've tried to show that algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance are really new forms of social ordering that we can observe in our digital societies, and that strongly shape the way that regulation and governance occurs, and also poses a number of issues and challenges for the future. And this whole area, I think, remains a really open field to be researched. So on the one hand, conceptually and theoretically, through further working on these concepts of algorithmic regulation and algorithmic governance, but then also on the empirical level, really, where there's really a large amount of empirical cases that are still to be studied and analyzed and so on. And this whole research effort, I think, in the future needs to be strongly interdisciplinary to really grasp both this sort of computer science and mathematics component of the algorithmic systems, but then also the more social science, sociology, political science, anthropology side of it, of all the social practices around algorithmic regulation and governance. And so before I stop, just two final reading recommendations for you, if you're interested in these topics. So there's a really great edited volume called Algorithmic Regulation from 2019, edited by Karen Young and Martin Lodge, which has a large number of really interesting articles about the foundations of algorithmic regulation. And then a little bit more recently, there's a special issue of the journal Regulation and Governance, edited by Lena Ulbricht and Karen Young, which contains this article about the extended framework that I talked about earlier, but also many, many other really, really interesting articles about algorithmic regulation. And so with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to discussing.